Hello, everyone. As Yunus just said, my name is Toghrul. I don't really know what I do. I just probably complain about things on Twitter most of the time, but people, for some reason, refer to me as a researcher. I don't really do research. Today, we're going to be talking about a subject that I've spoken about quite a lot of times throughout the year, and I can't believe we're in 2025 and I'm still talking about it. So a few things changed throughout the years. I think my first Cryptist talk was on a similar subject. Few things changed since then. Primarily, my presentations became less effort. I put less effort in my presentations. That's the main change. But yeah, the subject today is what is a roll-up? I'm not sure if you guys have seen this meme. It's been going around Twitter for the last 2 years or so. It's the main premise is we don't know how to do it. Originated here, where some guy tweeted about his father-in-law going to some cathedral and saying that we can't do it anymore. We don't know how to do it, and it also applies to rollups. For some reason, we somehow unlearned how to build rollups. So this is the reason why I'm giving this talk. This project triggered me, and I kind of had to give this talk. So it's a project called Facet, and it claims to be the first unstoppable, whatever the hell that means, L2 rollup. Well, let's start with the most obvious. It's not an L2. They're lying to you. I don't know why they're doing it, but they're lying to you. But first, before I explain to you why it's not an L2 but it is a rollup, as the slide says, it is technically a rollup, and you might be confused. How can it be a rollup but not be an L2? Well, this is what my talk is going to be about, and how do you differentiate between the two, and basically that you can be a rollup without being an L2. So first, let's start with the definition of rollup. A rollup is a layer 2 blockchain scaling solution that executes transaction off-chain and posts compressed data or proofs back to the main chain, inheriting its security while increasing throughput and reducing costs. No, actually, I'm lying. This is what ChatGPT told me rollup is. It doesn't really know what a rollup is. This is the actual definition of a rollup. A rollup is a construction that publishes minimum viable data required for you to reconstruct the state of the protocol. And that data has to be published on another protocol, so it's a rollup relative to another protocol. So for example, if it's Optimism, it's a rollup relative to Ethereum. If it's, I don't know, some chain that is settling on Celestia, it's going to be a rollup relative to Celestia, etc. And for example, a Bitcoin rollup can exist, etc. So, and that is it basically. That is the definition of a rollup. Everything else is just an implementational detail. But of course, implementational details do matter. So let's explore more about that. And we need to start by basically understanding the rollup is an umbrella term. It covers a few different constructions that can vary differently in terms of their security and in terms of why they even exist. And the two main ones are sovereign and classic rollups. So let's start with sovereign rollups. Sovereign rollups by default inherit data availability guarantees from the underlying base layer. So what I mean by data availability is basically it's a guarantee that within a certain period of time, say 2 weeks to 1 month, any willing party that wants to retrieve the data to reconstruct the state can do it within that month. And after that, it's a different problem. So people shouldn't be confusing data availability with data storage, because data storage is a problem of basically retrieving data and storing the data indefinitely. And that's a more complex problem that is harder to solve, etc. But it's irrelevant for this, so let's skip it. It's boring. And then you might hear me mention the term base layer quite a few times. So in this case, base layer just means the protocol that is used to provide guarantees to another protocol. So again, going back to the example of Optimism and Ethereum is the base layer for Optimism, and etc. So like in case of, for example, Citria, the base layer would be Bitcoin. And additionally, note that this is not the default construction. The default construction just guarantees data availability. But you can construct a sovereign rollup in a way where it inherits ordering and eventual censorship resistance guarantees from the underlying layer. So in this case, ordering just means that when the transactions are sequenced, the sequence in which the transactions are are ordered is preserved, and it guarantees that the order is never going to be reorged later on. And eventual censorship resistance. One note here that censorship resistance is quite non-trivial to define because there are a lot of edge cases that you can bring up, and so this is a very simplistic definition, but like I don't want to bore you with like an hour-long talk about like fee payments and how you can censor fee-paying transactions, etc. So let's assume that any fee-paying transaction is included after a certain delay. So, for example, in case of Ethereum rollups, in most cases, eventual censorship means that the delay is 24 hours, and after that, it inherits the censorship resistance guarantees of Ethereum. But you can construct a rollup with different guarantees. And I forgot one thing here. You shouldn't be confusing that with real-time censorship resistance. So real-time censorship resistance just means this, that as soon as the transaction is ordered, it receives the same guarantees of censorship resistance as the underlying base layer, which is not true for a very, very, very boring and niche reason. I don't want to bore you guys with that. So yeah, so going back to this, Facet is a sovereign rollup. It's not an L2. It's a sovereign rollup that just publishes data on Ethereum. And then let's go to the other family of rollups. These are the rollups that we actually call rollups, but they're not rollups. As we previously described, rollup is just a construction to post data. Everything else is basically a subcategory of a rollup. So classic rollups inherit data availability, ordering, eventual censorship resistance, and validity guarantees from the underlying base layer. And one thing to note here, terms and conditions applied. So validity, you do inherit and you don't. So, and I'll cover that right now. So first, let's explore what validity actually means. Validity guarantees just mean that you are guaranteed that the state transition function is correctly applied and enforced by the enforcing mechanism. And in case of classic rollups, validity guarantees are enforced under 1 of n, where it's important to note that n has to be unbounded, because if you don't do that, it's quite easy to construct a permissioned committee that has, 10 members, and you only need one of them to be honest, and it's not as secure as an unbounded construction. So it can be 1 of n in case of optimistic rollups, or it can be just the soundness of the underlying zero-knowledge proof construction if you're using a ZK proof. So if it's a ZK rollup, essentially. And as I mentioned the terms is state transition function before. State transition function means that there is some deterministic set of rules that define how the system mutates the state based on the current state and the input that you provide. So in case of standard blockchains, the input would be the transaction that is being processed. And in a classic rollup, the guarantees are enforced via the validating bridge. So you need a validating bridge to enforce those guarantees. And just to explain what a validating bridge, it's a general purpose messaging construction deployed on the base layer. So in case of the majority of the rollups, it's going to be Ethereum, but again, they can be generalized to other chains as well. And the validating bridge is set to be trust minimized if it can securely operate under the affirmation assumption. So it's 1 of n because you can only enforce validity under 1 of n or lower. If you don't, then it's not trust minimized and it's trustless. And it's a bit of a tangent, but like just a reminder, trustless bridges don't exist. Whenever somebody refers to a bridge as a trustless bridge, they're probably lying to you or they don't understand what trustless means. And a validating bridge enforces the canonical view of the rollup. So essentially what that means is if you have you can have multiple views. So let's say in a consensus, you can have each consensus participant can have different views. In case of a rollup, the view of the validating bridge is the most important one. It's basically you have a social consensus that agrees that whatever the validating bridge sees as the default view, that's the correct view. Obviously, there can be exceptions with bugs, etc., but we just, for the theoretical construction, we just assume that bugs don't exist. Unfortunately, in real world, they do, but whatever. Let's ignore that for now. And most commonly, validating bridges are deployed as smart contracts on the base layer, and that technically doesn't have to be. For example, Tezos just enshrines the validating bridge into the L1, so you can essentially deploy numerous L2s without deploying your own bridge. But in case of Ethereum and most of the other chains, you actually have to deploy a smart contract that represents that bridge. And they also frequently enshrine upgradability of the core components of the bridge. That's done for multiple reasons. One is security. Another, let's say if you want your rollup to be EVM equivalent, then you have to always be in line with what EVM spec says, and therefore you have to be able to upgrade it from time to time in order to keep up with the changes that EVM undergoes from time to time. And so, in order to ensure that the validating bridge enforces the required guarantees under the previously stated assumptions, we need to impose a delay on upgradability to ensure that we can enforce those guarantees under the assumptions that I mentioned before. And so basically, that is another guarantee that classic rollups have to provide. It's temporary immutability of the validating bridge. And you can rightfully point out that most of the existing classic rollups don't comply with this definition. And you are right, they are what Vitalik likes to call proto-rollups, so they're not fully fledged rollups but are constructions that essentially, in a way, you could say imitate what rollups do, but still don't provide all the guarantees that a rollup is required, the classic rollup is required to provide. And for upgradability, the minimum delay has to be 28 days, and this is to ensure that in case there's an invalid upgrade, for some reason, let's say like the DAO or the multisig has voted for a malicious upgrade, then users have enough time to exit and withdraw to an L1 or move to a different rollup, whatever they want to do really with their own money. And from that, we just go to the specific constructions. Again, classic rollup is an umbrella term that can represent both optimistic and zero-knowledge rollups. And in case there's anyone from Starkware in the crowd, zero-knowledge rollups are validity rollups, because usually when Starkware people hear zero-knowledge rollups, they get confused for some reason. And let's start with optimistic rollups. So in an optimistic rollup, the validity is enforced optimistically by allowing external parties to challenge the state commitment within some challenge window. And what that means is, by default, we assume that the state commitment is true, and we only change it and basically change it to a different state commitment if somebody creates a challenge saying, hey, by the way, it's not the correct one. And if the challenge window expires without anyone initiating the challenge, then we just finalize the state and assume that it was correct. So you can see why you actually need at least one honest party, because you need someone to actually impose that challenge and to say, no, you need to check this thing because this thing doesn't sound right. And challenges are initiated via mechanisms called fraud proofs. And same with the Starkware team. The Optimism team doesn't really know what fraud proofs are. They like to refer to them as fault proofs. So yeah, just in case someone from Optimism is here, it's fault proofs. And fraud proofs can be non-interactive single round or interactive multi-round. So what that means is you can either submit a challenge, just execute it fully, and then update the state commitment, or you can have a back and forth between the challenger and the asserter, and depending on the implementation, the asserter can be the same person who committed the initial state root, or it can be somebody else. It can be permission. It's both work. And the difference there is the trade-offs that they introduce. Interactive multi-round is more complex. You have to ensure the economics the underlying game theory works fine, etc., etc. Non-interactive is more problematic because a challenge has to fit within a single transaction. So let's say on Ethereum, in case of Ethereum, for example. So let's say if your block on Optimism, let's say size is the same size as a block on Ethereum, and the single transaction consumes the entire block on Optimism, you cannot challenge that transaction on Ethereum in one go because it just won't fit. And so you would essentially have to either break it down or just have smaller blocks in the L2. And that was the one of the problems that Optimism faced, because they originally had non-interactive single round fraud proofs, and then they switched to interactive multi-round fraud proofs for that reason. There are other reasons, but they're like more niche, and I don't think we need to bring them up. And one thing to note here is that optimistic rollups can actually utilize zero-knowledge proofs for the challenge mechanisms, but you shouldn't be confusing them with zero-knowledge rollups, because zero-knowledge rollups require you to post the ZK proof for every single state transition, whereas in an optimistic rollup, you only have to post that ZK proof if you use the ZK proof for fraud proofs, only in cases where you need to challenge and the original commitment was invalid. And now the final part, the zero-knowledge rollups, which is, I'm a cryptist, and the first time I bring up zero knowledge is after like 15 minutes talking. So in a zero knowledge rollup, validity is enforced by the zero knowledge proof attesting to the correctness of the intermediate state transition. So basically, you have this zero knowledge proof that is capable of enforcing whatever state transition function you have. So let's say in Ethereum, that would be the Ethereum state transition function. In Solana, that would be SVM plus all the supporting components around it. And basically what it does, it computes a succinct proof that you publish on chain with the state root commitment. And basically that allows the validating bridge to verify the correctness and enforce and instantly finalize the state root commitment after the proof is verified. And yeah, as I said, the state root commitment is finalized as soon as the zero knowledge proof is asserted by the bridge. And one last thing about that, because it happens quite a lot, zero knowledge rollups do not have any privacy preserving properties. So it's one of the quirks about defining them as zero knowledge rollups, because people assume that, oh, there's some privacy there or whatever. There's actually none. They're actually just using zero knowledge proofs for the succinctness of the correctness enforcement mechanism. But you can technically construct a zero knowledge rollup that is privacy preserving. So for example, Aztec, who are going to launch later in the year, are going to be what they call themselves ZK rollup. So they're going to use both ZK for both succinctness of the state transition proof and also privacy. But yeah, but that's not a given, and most of the existing constructions do not have any privacy whatsoever. So yeah, that is it. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Yes?
I was wondering, like you said, that if optimistic rollups use ZK proofs for challenges, then they would still be optimistic rollups because they only use ZK in the case of fraud. Let's say that an optimistic rollup has an optimistic proof in the term that, like, for one day the proof is not submitted. The proof should eventually be submitted, and if it's not submitted, then it is like a fraud that rollup fails. Would we name this as an optimistic rollup?
No, that's a ZK rollup. But essentially, that's what happens with most of the ZK rollups. They don't submit proofs very frequently because they're expensive to verify on Ethereum. So, for example, I think Starkware verifies their proofs once every 12 hours or 8 hours. So essentially, in a way, it is optimistic rollup, but it's not. It's a ZK rollup that basically delays verification on chain because it's expensive to do that. So that would just be a ZK rollup with delayed verification on chain.
And the fact that the proof generation should be permission or permissionless, does it change the trust assumptions of the rollup?
Yeah. It has to be permission. So I presume you're talking about challenges, right? Because a proof submission, I would say it doesn't matter because that's more of a liveness assumption rather than a security assumption. Because a ZK proof is either correctly constructed or not. It doesn't matter if you have like 100 honest participants or only one. But ideally, I would say it has to be permissionless because that ensures the liveness of the protocol is also preserved. But that's not strictly required for it to be defined as a ZK rollup. Yes.
Can you explain how to implement privacy preserving in an increasing scale, like, for example, Alio, Aztec, Circuit, like what do they implement and like how robust is the privacy preserving?
So, for example, Aztec, the previous version of Aztec, I think it's ZK Money version 3, they essentially run a Zcash-like construction as a rollup, and then they compute, they construct the rollup, and then they compute the state transition proof for. So essentially, they compute the proofs are computed for individual transactions that are then aggregated into a single proof that proves that that each transaction is valid, and that proof is posted on chain along with the data for the proofs. But you can extend it to more generalized constructions. But that's the general approach: is you construct proofs for individual transactions that are preserving privacy, and then you aggregate those proofs along with the entire transactions to prove that they were correctly executed. Yeah. Yeah, that's the main approach, basically. You could generalize it to Alio and others as well, but yeah, that's the way it works.
Are all of them doing the same?
No, Alio is an L1, so the only one that is currently live, but it's deprecated, so I wouldn't recommend using it, is Aztec ZK Money version 3, but they're launching another version. I don't know if it's this year or next year, but the next version is going to be launching relatively soon, and they're going to be doing that.
Thank you.
Thank
you for
you.
like an amazing speech. Thank you very much.